we're going to jump into a starter fertilizer full tilt. We're going to be waist head deep in this stuff here. So if you don't want to know all you want to know about starter fertilizer, why this you need to bow out right now, because we're going to look at management techniques and technology here. And we're going to start at the basic. Why do we use starter fertilizer? What in the world is it that we're trying to accomplish by utilizing a starter fertilizer? And by starter fertilizer, I mean something that we're applying with our planter at planting time. It could be in the furrow, it could be in a band. It's by that definition, you could be broadcasting it for that matter. Why do we use a fertilizer at that time? Well, there's two reasons that I can think of, and maybe you've got some others. And by the way, feel free to jump in and ask a question, or at least put something on chat. I'll try to keep this chat box open over here. Why do we use a starter fertilizer in our planting systems here? Well, there's two reasons. One, which I think is the most important reason, and that is we try to influence the development of root systems underneath the plant, particularly nodal roots of this plant. That's I've talked about this at my meetings a lot this season to try to drive home this point. And we're in corn, we're trying to influence those first 6 nodal roots that are really important in developing the nutrient uptake and water uptake under our plant. In a soybean plant, you'd be trying to influence the primary root system of the plant. And other crops, it may be different roots that you're really interested in. Corn, it's the nodal root system. So that's, in my opinion, one of the key, if not the reason for using starter fertilizer. Now, that may not be your reason. You may be wanting to supply nutrients to the soil. You've got your soil test back and you need a little more P or a little more K, and you say, well, gee, this is the way I'm going to do that. These two approaches are very, very different. I think that you've got to recognize that these are not the same approaches. In the first approach, you're trying to place fertilizer, the right type of fertilizer, and the right amount of fertilizer in the right spot to influence root development. In the second approach, you're trying to get enough fertilizer to meet demand, and in point of fact, probably ought to keep it out of the root area because you're probably putting on a lot more than you really need to influence root development. So these are very, very different approaches. Oftentimes, when people talk to me about supplying nutrients to a crop, or they talk about starter fertilizer, they're talking about this second thing here. They're not talking about developing root systems. So I want to make that clear right off the bat. It does make a difference as to what your goal is, as to how you're going to utilize and the principles you're going to use in using starter fertilizer here. So this is the nodal root system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I just wanted to re-familiarize yourself with where these nodal roots in a corn plant are. This is important. It's important when we talk about placement later on. You're trying to influence nodal roots here, not so much the seminal root system. Seminal roots are roots coming out of the seed. You can see those down below here. You're trying to influence the nodal roots from these first 5 internodes that are all located and will be located throughout the entire corn season, down here about 3/4 to an inch below the soil surface. That's in the system. It's very different if you were applying starter to a soybean plant. You'd want starter under this seed in a soybean plant for sure if you're going to influence uptake of the primary root. And again, different crops, you need different ways of looking at placement, amounts, and types of fertilizer. We're going to focus on corn exclusively because that's the science that I have here. But keep that in mind. If this is the purpose, influencing root development, you have different setups for crops that you farm. All right. So is starter important? That's the first question I wanted. I've got this program divided into sections. First section I got is starter important? And I have shown these slides this year, and I'm going to show some more data that supports them. But indeed, we see oftentimes that starter does make a difference, and it makes a difference in the main thing that we're looking at influencing, which is fruit development. So I've shown this picture at my meetings this year. Many have seen it. You're tired of it, I'm sure. There's the check, no starter. My ring finger is pointing to those first 5 nodes, and you can see the amount of nodal root development that I have here. If I go forward and look at here's a 10 gallons of a 1027O in a 2x2, 3x2x2 band. In other words, on both sides of the row. And it doesn't take long to look at those plants and see that they're bigger, or to look at the root system and see that indeed it's enhanced. And that's what we're trying to achieve, is that enhanced root system under starter fertilizer. So indeed, that shows that starter does have an influence here. And here's what that difference was. There was a 50 bushel difference between those treatments in Bertie County in 2020, showing, and this is not the only time I've seen this kind of huge difference between no starter and a starter applied. Here's another example, goes back to 2010. There's a check. This was down in Whiteville at the border belt, so that's again a sandy soil down there. But a check, 1137.0, a 1027.0, let's say 1027.0 with Rotec. And you can see here again, we were looking at a 50, 60 bushel yield advantage to starter. So this effect can be very significant when all the stars align and everything works. And of course, the stars aligned in 2020, and as they did in 2010 with wet, cool, early season weather that set the stage for the impact of growing more roots and getting more nutrient uptake early in that corn plant season. Now, we don't always see that much of an effect. I think we need to, I want to just be clear about that as we talk about starter. I don't want you to come away here, oh man, starter's going to change my life. It will and can change your life, but it also cannot do anything at all. Here's a comparison in 2015 on an organic soil down in Terrell County. And you can see here, we've got some difference. There's no starters that very first bar. There's a 1027.0 at 10 to 20 gallons. You can see there we're making what, 7, 8 bushel differences there at best. If I put an in-furrow starter there, 31818, 1919.0, a 30% in-furrow, actually my yields were somewhat suppressed. That's probably a salt effect, and I used micros even there. Still didn't improve yield. A 717 material actually didn't do too bad in the furrow. And then we use some combinations, both in the furrow as well. The 1027.0 was a 2x2 band, and the 31818 or the 1919.0 was applied in furrow. So you can see very, very modest differences here. And if I put a cost to these differences, well, you can see there were only a few treatments where I actually came out ahead of spending the money to put the starter fertilizer down. And indeed, these are their situations. In this case, we planted in a warmer soil. The soil had pretty good supply of P2O5. In other words, nutrient levels were high. There were all the good things that to get those root systems established early were already in place here. And you've seen other data. I'm not going to drag you through a lot of data on looking at the impact of starter overall. But you've seen other data. Carl Crozier's done studies that only about 2 out of 7 of his studies had a positive starter effect. You know, one of the things I want to accomplish here today is try to separate some of the practices that we're doing to make sure we get that larger starter effect time and time again. When I look at starter use over the years that I've tested this, and you can see it goes back to 2000, actually goes back before 2010, goes back into 2008. So I've been at this for over 10 years. Why, I would say in the vast majority of cases, I had a very positive yield and economic benefit to starter. In 80% of the trials, 80% of the tests, I get a economic yield benefit to starter. But there are 20% of the time, and if we don't use starter right or correctly, don't place it right, why we're more likely, like in Carl's case, more likely not to see this positive yield or economic benefit. It's got to be placed right at the right amount, and you've got to remember what your goal is in doing this is really know the root development. In the Midwest, we're going to talk about forms of starter fertilizer here in a second, but in the Midwest, they do a lot of nitrogen as a starter fertilizer. Now, in my opinion, that you're trying to fertilize rather than influence root development in those systems. I think in those cases, you're going to have much less luck in getting a positive yield and economic benefit from starter. And then here's what we saw. Again, a slide I've used a lot in programs this year because this just emphasized that 2020. I could be on an organic soil. I could be on a clay loam in the Piedmont. I could be in a sandy silt loam in the coastal plain and still have a starter effect. Again, if you remember me mentioning this, we're comparing these treatments with the enhanced. The enhanced had the 38,000 seeding rate, the starter, all of it, the main sulfate. In this case, I just want you to focus on that red bar versus where we did not use the starter. So it was the enhanced. We had the other three treatments in there. We dropped the starter. So if the starter had an effect, we would see a significant drop in yield. So you can see that in Beaufort County. That's what that little hash mark of the yellow bar says. A significant drop in yield if we drop the starter. Wayne County, big drop in yield. In fact, I've shown some pictures. That the difference in plant size at B5 and root mass was just astounding, quite frankly. Terrell County, significant. Robeson County was significant. Surrey County. So that, again, drives home the point I'm trying to make, that if we use starter in the right situation, it can be life-changing. Indeed, it can change your yield potential. So that's the first thing I want us to get into our mind, that indeed there is a positive benefit to utilizing starter, that indeed there are times when it's huge, and then there are still times when we're not receiving that benefit. And when we're not receiving the benefit, we need to examine how are we using, what's our purpose for using starter to make sure that we do get that economic benefit. The cost not just in material, but also in terms of equipment. And we certainly will look at that here in a little while. All right, so that's the first question I wanted to review for you, is the value of starter fertilizer in a corn planting system. Second question, I want us to look at the same thing you always should look at when you look at fertilizer use, and that's the R's, the 4 R's, the right time of application, the right source of application, the right placement of application, and the right rate of application. We're going to break these into 2 groups here. We're going to start with the right time and right source. And the right time's easy. I don't need to spend many slides on this. We're doing this at planting. And we're doing this at planting time. What are you going to influence at planting time? There's only 2 things you can change in that crop growth. You can either influence the amount of nutrients you're applying there, or you can influence some of the development of the plant. And what are you influencing the development of the plant? It's roots development. Those first things that are going to develop from that corn plant, or any plant for that matter. So you're trying to influence roots. So the timing here is self-evident. It's planting. Let's take a look, though, at this next one. What is the right source of material? What's the right fertilizer or materials to use to get some of these effects that we're talking about? So here's a study we did. This, I think, does go back to 2008. This was we were trying to understand which component of starter fertilizer, the N, P, and K, was most important. And I'll have to say that this science is still open. I'm dealing, John Deere has wanted to put a huge project in North Carolina testing one new planter that they're trying to develop that brings to apply starter. And they are still not sure what they should be focused on, whether they should be focused on applying nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. Well, here's Here's what data I have at looking at which of those elements is key in a starter effect. So there's no starter on the right, 12, 12, 4 on the left. So there's a blended fertilizer, equal parts NP. And obviously, you can't get that much potassium in that material in a liquid form. So as a result, there's only 4% potassium here. But you can see clearly we've got a starter effect. We increase size and we actually enhance development of the crop. You can see we've got tassels here. So which part of this 12-12-4 is important? Well, here's just 30%. So there's just applying 30%, 20 gallons the acre versus a 10-20-7-0. And I've got some avail in there, but that avail was trying to influence or enhance the phosphorus effect here. So I'm really trying to test the phosphorus here against just straight nitrogen. Now the two sizes are not terribly different than we saw before, so certainly nitrogen is having some effect, but you can see the development effect is from that phosphorus, and the size is greater with the phosphorus. If I look at the other end of the spectrum, I use that same 10-20-7-0 plus the avail versus a 00-27 material. Well, you can again see clearly the 20s of potassium is not having the effect that either nitrogen or phosphorus has here. And looking at trials over numerous times and numerous years, it's become clear that the key element here, particularly from the standpoint if your purpose is root development, nodal root development, has to be phosphorus. Here's the difference in root development between no starter and phosphorus. And we've dug, I went back and looked at some of the trials we did in the 2008 to 2012, digging roots, and without exception, it was clear that every time we used a phosphorus, heavy phosphorus material, we got a significant improvement in root volume in that field there. Here's measurements that we took here. There's two different hybrids. Yeah, well, you can see how old this is. You can recognize those Pioneer hybrids. You know that's not recent here. But there's root mass. So there's the 10-20-7-0. We got the blended fertilizer. We got 17-17 compared to 30%. And a check. Comes pretty clear here that anytime we had phosphorus here, we had more root mass in this thing compared to 30%. Here's plant height. Here we have the 0020 in addition to the 30% in this test in 2009. And again, you can see plant height, there's significant increase in plant height where we use the 10-27-0, 12-12-4, not so much difference between that and the 30%. We just didn't have enough phosphorus there. So that's plant height. There's the grain yield from that same study in Hyde County, and the highest yield was with that 10-20-7-0. So a clear indication here of the role that phosphorus is playing in influencing yield and development in this plant. So phosphorus has, in my opinion, has to be of interest when we think about nodal root development in the plant. Now, again, I'm going to come back and mention this because in dealing with John Deere on trying to design the study, it became clear to me over this last 2 or 3 months that many growers in the Midwest are just applying 30% nitrogen. They're just applying nitrogen fertilizer. And my data suggests that, oh, yeah, nitrogen will help a little bit. It'll certainly green up the plant. You might get a yield bounce from early nitrogen. I don't dispute that. But you're not affecting nodal root growth. And so therefore, your goal with a nitrogen application as a starter is very different than influence in nodal root development. So I'm just going to mention that because I just in my mind, that's settled science, but it's clear that to the industry and to the greater scientific community as a whole, there's still some a lack of understanding about which nutrient should be focused on in a starter formulation. Now, what about ratio? I hear this, or used to hear it quite a bit. Don't hear it as much anymore. Is there a difference between, say, a 1-2, or you could even go 11-30-7-0? You're almost 1-4 or 3-4 there. Nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, or 1-to-1 ratio, A lot of the early work we did in starter fertilizer was with a 1919 or 1717. If you blended it yourself, that's what the ratio was. You just put half 30% and half 1137 together, and you got 1717. But you can see here that, and this is typical of the data we've had from looking at these two forms, there's not a whole lot of difference here. You know, clearly I got more phosphorus in the 1027 at the same usage rate, but I'm not changing my yield. And that's the other factor that we have to recognize in looking at nutrient, particularly phosphorus influence. And sometimes we don't need very much to get this impact, this nodal root growth impact. So 1717 worked as just the same as 1027. And in point of fact, I don't know that there's a whole lot of difference between many different formulations. I probably could have thrown 1137 in here and not had much difference in yield, as long as I had enough phosphorus to create the concentrations I needed in the critical root area of the developing plant. Now, there's reasons typical today. I've been using a 1027 fertilizer with micronutrients added to it, and there's reasons for me to do that. When I tried to use 1717 or 1919, the problem with those materials is they're not stable in cooler temperatures. And I'm carrying fertilizer on a trailer across the state. Oftentimes that trailer sits out in the open for cool nights, and then I get some salting out from that 1717 or 1919, which then makes it difficult to apply that starter. I've got a problem. I can't get uniform distribution or application. 1027 is much more stable. Yeah, I could use 11, and I have used 1137, and it has worked fine for me. The reason that I have gone to a 1027 is the micronutrient component of it. I really need, in many cases, I'm on sandy soils one day and on organics the next, or in the Piedmont. I need something I can use across a wide spectrum. So something with some sulfur and perhaps some zinc helps, in my opinion, enhance the value of that fertilizer. So the point I'm making here is when you start looking at what ratio of N to P works best, you got to recognize your situation and what it is that you're trying to do. And I've got some rules that I'll show you here in a minute. But I think you need to look carefully on your situation. Get enough phosphorus to get this phosphorus effect on nodal root development. Recognize we do need a little nitrogen. There's no doubt that some nitrogen enhances that effect. But utilize these ratios in your particular case. And if you need micronutrients, the same thing. Here's some comparisons of some different ratios. This was on the sandy soil, similar trial that I showed you on the organic soil earlier on, again in 2015. You see we got a lot bigger yield bump here, didn't we? So here we had the 1027 work pretty well there. These in-furrow application on the sandy soil, we obviously got salt entry, didn't we? Particularly if we use something like a 30% or a heavy rate of 31818. And then you can see there we could go with a 717, did all right, or even the blends here did okay. So you can see some different approaches there to trying to utilize different nutrients in a starter fertilizer program. If I look at, there's the economic differences. As long as I didn't burn it too significantly with that starter and furrow, why most of them I came out in a positive direction. The point I'm making is I'm not so concerned about these ratios. Get enough phosphorus there, get a little nitrogen to go with it. You should see the starter effect, regardless of what that ratio of N to P looks like. So again, focus on situations in your particular operation, what you need or what you feel you'd like to accomplish, in addition to influence root development there. Ortho-perfect
Dr.
pollen. Yeah, go ahead, Al. Sorry.
Quick, I don't know if anybody's thinking this, but say for example you're on a soil where tobacco or vegetables, some vegetable, and you've got a high P. What would
Right.
you say to that person that's in one of those situations?
Yes, well, there in those situations, I definitely hold my P back. In other words, I don't need as much P, so I don't need a 1-to-2 ratio. I could go with a blend, a 1-to-1 blend. Use my nitrogen to stimulate that phosphorus effect, and cut that phosphorus back. I I still want to, if I'm going to apply starter. In some of those cases, vegetables, you may have enough P already that starter isn't really uh, necessary. You're not going to get much more from a starter fertilizer. You may have those situations. There's no doubt that they exist in the state and that we can find them. But even in those situations, if I'm planting early or I'm planting and I know it's going to be cool and wet, even in those situations, a little starter can overcome some of that problem with cool and wet. Yeah, I've been talking about this a little bit in my meetings. The physics of moving phosphorus from the soil solution into the root is very important to consider as you think about this issue about which nutrients important and what kind of first starter should I be looking at. The physics are such that the plant has to expend energy. It has to expel a proton. What a proton is a hydrogen atom, basically. It has to expel a proton from the root, and in that, it exchanges energy with that phosphorus and allows it to come in. So it has to across the root membrane. So it has to expend energy. So what happens when we get into cold, wet soils? Well, it's cloudy, the plant is saturated, it's like wheat right now. It's hard to make photosynthesis. It's not uh, creating sugars or what we call assimilates from photosynthesis, energy from photosynthesis at a very high rate. And so as a result, there's a lack of energy in the root system to expel into the soil to exchange for phosphorus. Now, nitrogen will come right across the root. It doesn't need energy. It's absorbed because it's soluble, it moves right across the root membrane. But phosphorus needs that energy exchange. And so you see wheat right now looking purple. Angela's mentioned this. I see it in a couple of programs. That's because phosphorus requires energy. So even where I've got high levels of phosphorus from a vegetable or other crop, if I'm planting early or I'm seeing like the last 3-4 years, we've had periods of wet, cool weather in April, why I'm going to use a fun. Now, the blend I'm going to change. I'm going to go down in my phosphorus, up a little bit in my nitrogen to try to stimulate photosynthesis in the plant. But the nitrogen is important in the photosynthesis aspect. So I can stimulate photosynthesis and still have enough phosphorus there to get some early root effects in this plant. So I change my ratio a little bit. Or if I'm planting, say, late in April, early May, I know it's going to be warm. My need for starter fertilizer starts. I may get away with that or get by with it. And certainly, we're going to talk about rate here in a moment, but certainly rate comes now into play. How much P2O5 am I actually needing to put out there in those situations? That's a great question, Al, and one in which I get a lot. I've got lots of manure. I got high phosphorus indexes in my soil. Do I need really to apply a phosphorus starter fertilizer, or can I just get by with nitrogen? And my response to that is, what is the condition you're planting into? And that really dictates then whether I need that starter in the first place. Quite frankly, nitrogen. I have a hard time justifying. If all I'm going to apply is nitrogen as a starter fertilizer, I have a hard time justifying that. First of all, I'm going to keep it out of the trench. Second of all, I can't put enough in even in a 2x2 band. Right now John Deere's arguing they're going to try to put 100 pounds of nitrogen in a 2x2 band. I'm telling them that you're going to have problems doing that kind of stuff. You can't put that much in a 2x2 bed. Just broadcast nitrogen. It's soluble. If it's rainy, it's going to move into the soil. So I have a hard time justifying a nitrogen only starter application if your goal is really root development, or even if your goal is improving nitrogen fertilization. I think it's starter is a is a misapplication of doing that. But at any rate, that you got more than you bargained for on that question. So. All right, let's. I don't hear any complaints. Let me just touch one last topic as we talk about what source of material should we be looking at in a starter fertilizer, ortho or versus a polyphosphate. I don't know of a question that has been been used more, bandied around by scientists and industry and everybody else. And I have not tested this, so this is not my science here. But what I can discover in looking at studies that have looked at poly versus orthophosphate, basically an orthophosphate has some advantage. Poly has to be converted. They're just different manufacturing processes, but a polyphosphate has to break down in order to get uptake of that phosphate. So you'd think, oh, I want an ortho most of the time. Well, the data, the science suggests that actually the rate of breakdown in a polyphosphate is fairly rapid. Furthermore, there's also the issue about if a poly has less salt than an ortho. So you've got these kind of things going on. Every data set that I can find, particularly recent studies in the last 2 or 3 years and looking at ortho versus poly, and here's one of them, a 624-6 with different, you can be blended differently. So there's a 50-50 ortho poly is the green bar and an 80 ortho 20 poly is the black bar. About every study shows not really any difference in corn yield. Their effect in early growth is about the same. So I don't know that this is something that you want to focus a lot on in making the choice of what blend or what type of source of starter fertilizer to use. But my experience says that this is not really a critical factor in making that selection. The real selection is what ratios of nutrients to use, and of course whether to use micronutrients in the mix. So there's what data I have. Again, I have not tested this. This is data from the industry or from other researchers or other sources. All right, so let's just wrap up this source discussion with some observations here on sources of starter fertilizer. First of all, let's not, I badmouth nitrogen a lot here, but let's not make clear that nitrogen is important. It provides some synergy to the phosphorus. And so all starters, in my opinion, should include some nitrogen. And most every blend, you can't find a phosphorus only liquid. And so, or at least I don't know of one available, but so you're going to be using some nitrogen sources anyway. But I do think that's an important component. And particularly as we mentioned earlier, where phosphorus is readily available in situations why that nitrogen should be much more emphasized. Include micronutrients when necessary. Now, here are the situations where micronutrients, in my opinion, become necessary and where we see a response. Zinc. It's situations where litter has been used or where high soil test P levels exist. I use zinc. Why? Because I'm planting many times in grower fields where they have high soil test P. Zinc is basically allows phosphorus to be utilized by the plant. At high P situations, we can have a misbalance of zinc in the soil. I've heard David Hula, Randy Dowdy mention zinc as candy to the plant. I think that's probably overstating it a little bit, but I don't totally disagree that zinc in high yield situations where high levels of soil fertility exist is a benefit. We saw that when I was out the Piedmont here several years ago, and we saw 300 bushel yields where we use zinc and not where we did not. Sulfur. Now, you guys, many of you are using sulfur. We're not getting any sulfur at all from the air anymore. So, particularly sandier soils, the medium, low salt S levels, that's a no brainer there. In my opinion, on many of our sandy soils, you have to use sulfur at planting time to at least get some sulfur into the plants for early establishment, again, to utilize the growth factor that you're getting from the phosphorus. You got to get some sulfur there. And then you come back with a lay-by application of ammonium sulfate. So sulfur is a critical element. So indeed, on those cases, now on an organic soil, I don't always see a sulfur problem on organic soils. I could leave sulfur out in some. Again, my blend includes sulfur because one day I'll be on an organic, the next I'll be in a sand. So boron, we're seeing more folks utilize some boron in a starter blend. And I think in high yield or high stress conditions, boron has significant impact. We have seen boron applied to planting been beneficial yield wise through the season. And I quite frankly think it's as good to apply to planting as a lay-by application. So boron in high yield or high stress situations, I think should be thought of as part of the mix. And then magnesium. Now, mag is hard to use in a starter fertilizer. So I'm not suggesting that you go try to find a blend with a magnesium. But there are cases where I would apply magnesium at planting time. And that's when calcium and mag ratios exceed 5 to 1, 5 parts calcium and 1 part magnesium. These are typically sandy loam soils where maybe peanuts have been growing. We got to put some magnesium, and it's probably going to have to go in a separate application to your primary starter solution.
Dr. Heinegger.
Yes.
On boron, for the last, we've been in, and it varies some year, we've been in more of a rainy pattern. And the one thing that I'm really concerned about is boron, which I've heard you say, I think it takes maybe 3 to 4 ounces of boron.
Right, but, very small amount.
Yeah, but with the rainy weather patterns we've had in recent years, I'm wondering about, at least within the root zone, do we have enough? Could you address that?
Yeah, I mean, boron is a soluble element. It tends to move in the soil just like sulfur and nitrogen or calcium and magnesium do. And so in rainy, well, just like what we've had here, we've getting all these rains. And if you've got any internal drainage, and I hope you do, while these rains are moving, continually flushing in that soil, they're moving into the soil, percolating through the soil profile toward the groundwater. So they're moving these soluble elements down. And I think boron in many ways is similar to sulfur in that it's moving this mobile element down in the soil. So we're not seeing much boron at planting in that upper 4 inches where most of our early root development is going to take place. Now, boron is most critical at silking or pollination time. But I think the influence of boron early in the season, the plant will take it up and utilize it in building root. But it's important in tissue development. Why I think there is some places, and we're seeing folks use a quarter or a tenth a pound of boron in a starter fertilizer more often nowadays. So I do think under the rainy weather, we've been getting boron, sulfur become more important than they have in the past.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I've got a question here on the sandy loam soil. Some are considering blending 1137 with 24S to bump the NNS supplied, maybe even at a rate of 10 gallons. Should there be concerns with some of these sources and rates? Well, the sources don't bother me too much, but the rates, it depends how you're applying them. Your rates, particularly when you bump up N and S in a starter fertilizer, you're thinking about I've got to make sure I'm not putting too much close to that seed or in a place where that material is going toward that seed. So the rate of that material becomes an important consideration with those kind of sources where you're trying to even up your nitrogen and sulfur in relationship to the phosphorus there. You got a lot of phosphorus already in that blend, while you're going to be at 20% nitrogen, depending on how much you're going to put in there. So you're gonna have the old rule of thumb was 20 pounds of a salt in the seed trench. And I think, of course, he's talking a 2x2x2, so a double band. So you're at least 2 inches on each side. And of course, those concentrations on each side are smaller because they're divided between the two. So certainly, even there, you're going to have you're going to be limited. I don't think you're going to get 20 gallons. Certainly not of that material. 10 is probably about right in that case. So rate becomes important as you consider using those salt materials, even in banded applications. John Deere's wanting to put like I said, 100 units of nitrogen in a 2x2x2 band. I think that's stretching the limit of what you can achieve. Now, salt issues and these sources, it depends a lot, and I'm going to mention this here, I think, in a little while. It depends a lot on the environment. If you're wet, conditions, why that water dilutes that salt to some degree, so you don't have as much problem. Or if it turns dry right behind the planter, why then that concentrated salt becomes more of a problem because of the water that root is going to find is going to have a higher level of salts in it. That's the thing the root is growing toward. It's growing toward water. I used to have the concept, and that was true about, I think, in many academic thought, was that the root grew toward nutrients. Roots grow toward water, and that's why they grow in differential ways. They're looking for moisture. They're looking for higher concentrations of water, or in our case, lower concentrations of water where there's some air in the soil. But those roots are thinking about water, so they may move toward a application of fertilizer, mainly because it contains moisture, and if there's salts in that enhances. But I think he's looking at a 10-gallon rate. I'm not too concerned even at those sources there. No clear differences in the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus. In my opinion, when you're not applying in at planting and you've got lots of phosphorus already in the soil, you can use a 1-to-1 N to P ratio. In most situations, however, a 1-to-2, I think, is a pretty good fit for North Carolina. I don't see any real dramatic yield differences in choosing how much N do I need and how much phosphorus do I already have. Those help make that decision about what ratios of phosphorus to nitrogen you use. And as I mentioned earlier, no real difference in their supply of P as far as ortho versus poly, or the impact of salt concentration that we could see, or I can see, in research data. All right, so we've covered the source thing, and probably more than you wanted. Now let's talk about these two, which I think are really the crux of our problem in starter fertilizer: placement and rate. And the two go hand in hand together. Basically, the rule is the closer you can place it, the lower the rate you can use. That is the rule that I abide by. So let's take a look. There are several approaches that we can use here. We can use 2x2. We can put it below the seed in the furrow, basically an in row or pop-up placement right around the seed. We could band it over the row. I haven't done that. Surface dribble placement, I've done that, and banding under the row. Again, different ways of trying to place this starter fertilizer. So let's take a look at what science I have on these placement and some idea about this interplay between placement and rate that we're looking at here. So here's the studies that we did back in the late 90s here in North Carolina on both. This happens to be an organic soil in Pamlico County, but we did it on both organic and coastal plain soils, and looked at the comparison between just broadcasting a starter fertilizer or using placing that in a 2x2 band. So you can see here that there's some 5 gallons, 10 gallons of this 19, 20, and 40. there's a lot of fertilizer in 2x2 band at 40 gallons of that stuff. But you can see in broadcast, we're not influencing root depth, are we? We're not putting it where the root is going to take it up quickly enough to have much. Oh yeah, if I got the higher rates, got over 10 gallons, I got a little bounce there, but not much. But whereas if I put it in 2x2, the more fertilizer I put, the more root in development I got, and that's typical. Yeah, for starter fertilizers, usually more P2O5 in the root concentration, the better results we got. Here's what the corn yield looked like under that test. The broadcast, it was really no significant. You can see we weren't looking at 200 bushel corn here, but you could see that in the 2x2 band, we were getting a 20, 30 bushel bounce there with these different rates of starter fertilizer. I don't know what happened to my red bar there, but I think we had some harvest problems there with one of these plots. But at any rate, well, you could see the difference in corn yield here from those treatments. So indeed, broadcast, when you go back and look at what they were talking about here earlier, over the row banding, in my opinion, yeah, if you're going to do that, even at high rates, you're going to see less impact on corn root development and corn yield. How about 2x2 and pop-up? Those are probably the two most examined materials and ways of utilizing starter fertilizer that I am aware of here in North Carolina. This study we did back in 2008 and really formed the basis for my understanding of the role of a band, 2x2 band versus an in-furrow application. Now, I want to be clear about what we were doing here. In the in-furrow application, we were actually placing this fertilizer below the seed. We'll look at those different technologies here in a minute. Yeah, I need to get to it. It's already almost an hour I've been talking. But so we're putting this band or the in-furrow under the seed. So the tube's in front of the seed tube. We're placing it under the seed. So we're using an 1137.0 here, and we're putting it at different rates. So there's 5 gallons under the seed. There's 10 gallons. I mixed it half and half with water. So that's 5 gallons of actually a fertilizer. The rest is water. 5 gallons plus water, that's 2.5 gallons of a fertilizer. Here's 10 gallons in a 2x2 band here. Then I got 20 gallons. So that's 10 gallons of a fertilizer mixed with water. There's 10 gallons straight. No starter. 20 gallons, 40 gallons, 40 plus water. The thing you look at here is you look at yield. You'll notice that the 2x2 did have some advantage over the no starter. It was about 15 bushel, 10 to 15 bushels there, advantage there. And that we got a buy. Now this was an organic soil. It rained right behind this application here, but we got by with some pretty decent stiff rates of 1137 in the furrow there. So 10 gallons or 10 gallons where we mixed it with water were almost equally as good as a 2x2 band. And certainly smaller rates in furrow look very attractive here. Now, the comparison that I made at the time, and I think is still valid here, is looking at the impact on emergence. By placing that fertilizer in the root zone, particularly where those seminal roots are developing out of that trench, we can have an impact on the germination and emergence of corn. And so we saw that when we looked at population. So look at these 40-gallon rates. You can see we said there's no starter, that we were applying about 33,000 plants to the seeds to the acre. You can see when we counted plants later on at those higher rates, 40, 20 gallons of in-furrow fertilizer, we were significantly reducing stand there. Our 2x2 even had some impact at 10 gallons, but we didn't do too bad where we used water or even a small rate, 5 gallons plus water. Now again, this is an organic soil. This basically shows the interplay between rate and placement. You can get by with lower rates by placing it closer to where those emerging roots are, but you pay a price if you get salt concentration around that seed. And then here's a more recent study. We looked at a 318-18 fertilizer here versus a 1027-0. So this is a little more applicable to some of the fertilizers I've been using in the last several years. And again, you can see these small lower rates of 5 gallons in these three trials here matched up pretty well with these 20-gallon rates in a 2x2 band. So small amounts indeed can be just as effective in a fertilizer impact. How about this newer technique, this 2x2x2 or 3x2? You know, there's different ways of looking at how you designate this thing. An ideal 2x2 would be you 2 inches away from the seed, 2 inches down, and then dump on each side of the row. A 3x2 in my parlance is that you're now 3 inches away from the seed on the horizontal and still 2 inches down on the vertical. So those are how I sort of designate that application in this. We've seen some benefits by splitting that furrow, and I'm going to show some more here in a second. Here's some earlier data for 2017. We ran tested 2017, 18, 19, and again this last year. And this, the reason I'm using this chart is because it sort of defines some of the differences we've seen, anywhere from 8.9 bushels to 15 bushels in difference between using it on both sides of the row, which is what that high was there. We used a 2x2x2 or 3x2x2 if I get technical, both sides of the row, versus where I dropped it. So I just was putting it on one side of the row. You could see 262 went to 253. So that meant that I gained 8.9, or 271 went to 255. So this sort of defines what we've seen from that technique. It appears that indeed splitting that fertilizer, now this was at a 20-gallon rate, splitting that fertilizer had some impact. And I think it goes back again to what we've seen or talked about as far as where the roots go. They grow toward water. So if there's water on one side of the trench, and say you put a 2x2 band and that band dried out a little bit, why that root's not likely to head in that direction. And so therefore we don't always pick up that fertilizer as quickly as we'd like to do so. So here's an illustration of both rate and placement here from this test that we did last year up at the Peanut Belt Research Station. So here's a 624-6, so obviously a 1-to-3 ratio of nitrogen and phosphorus with a little potassium in it at 3 gallons in furrow. And so the no starter, yeah, you saw that plant earlier. It's on the left. And here's where we use this in furrow at that rate, and we got better growth and better nodal root development. So that's 7 pounds of P2O5. If I go to a 10-gallon rate at a 3x2x2, I think I showed you this picture earlier on here. Well, you can see we even get a more enhanced growth, root development compared to the no starter. Now, if I go to just a 2x2 at that 10-gallon rate, now it starts to look a little different. You can see that the plants there don't look as good as the 3x2x2 at the same rate. They're a little shorter. The plant from this 10-gallon 2x2 is in the middle. The 3x2x2 is on the right there. Of course, the no starter on the left. Certainly, we enhance this growth a little bit, but we're not having the same effect. We're not getting as much fertilizer to that root as quickly by having it just on one side. So let's go to a 20-gallon. Did I skip over a slide here? No, I'm fine. So I'll go to a 20-gallon in a 2x2. And again, you can see the 20-gallon in a 2x2 looks better. So going to higher rates has increased the interception of the phosphorus at the right amount at the right time on this. So it looks better than the 10 gallons. Still not as good as just 10 gallons in a 3x2 band. And then if I go to, here's a 20 gallons in a 3x2x2, and that's the middle plant there. Now the right plant is just 10 gallons in a 2x2, so it's definitely smaller, but you can see the size of these plants. Look at all the root mass under there. So I go an even higher rate at a double band here. You see all this growth that we get, and just prolific, amazing amount of root mass there at the same growth stage in this plant. Again, I'm stepping through these quickly because you guys have seen some of these. And then here's a info application of a 620 with some zinc. Again, the plant in the middle is this application. One on the right is a 2x2 band at 10 gallons to the acre, and one on the left is a no starter, similar to what I saw in the 624-6 there as far as that goes at both root and mass. And then here's these ears. Let me take my picture out here that just is distracting. There's the check. You can see the stress we had on those ears at pollination time. The 624-6 looks very good. 1027 and the double 3x2x2, whether at 10 or 20 gallons up at the top. If I can see those total ears at the 20 gallons, you can see they look just maybe a little bit better. And then you can see that the 10 gallon or 20 gallon in just a 2x2 band doesn't match up as well. It's a little better, certainly at 20 gallons. Those ears at 10 gallons didn't look very good in this trial. And here's what those data showed. And some interesting things that we see that really help us define. You can see here the big differences in, I showed this earlier, big differences between the check and yield here. I use it as starter fertilizer. But where should I apply? The question you got to be asking here is, where should I place the fertilizer and how much should I have used? And you can see what the root development, how we impacted it. More phosphorus, more early phosphorus to the root, the bigger roots. So you thought about the 20 gallons of 10270 and 3x2x2. That was the biggest root system out there. And ideally, that should have been the highest yield, shouldn't it? But it wasn't. It was very similar to the 10 gallons of a 3x2x2, the 624-6, or even the black label zinc, which was that 620 with zinc material. All had the same yield basically. Yeah, I know they're slightly numerically different, but statistically they're the same. Why? Well, this is the problem with phosphorus. It not just grows roots, it grows above ground. I mentioned this before. We had huge plants in this 20 gallons. By the time we got to silking, lots of transpiration. So the rate and placement of a starter fertilizer starts to come down to how much do I really need of that P2O5? How much is it that I really need? I don't want to put more than I really need. And as that rate goes down, the more likely I am to try to move it closer to the seed. So you can see what I was saying earlier about if I'm in a high P soil behind cabbage, I don't need a lot of P2O5. Maybe just a little in a pop-up would be just perfect for the environment that I have. That rate and the placement become interconnected. Now you can see the 2x2 and at 10 gallons and 20. Certainly 20 gallons, we had enough material that spread out from the band, roots connected to it earlier. We got some response. The 10 gallons, you can see by those ears, we just did not connect and get enough root development early enough to have a response. And again, now you could say, well, here's another way to limit my growth here on a sandy soil, or if I got lots of people, well, you're wasting all P2O5 there, aren't you? It is the same thing. You're just placing it further away from the plant, so you minimize how much. To me, that's not the reason you're using a starter fertilizer. Now, if all you're trying to do is raise phosphorus index, I suppose that's not a bad approach to it. So you can see this interplay between rate and the placement that we're talking here. So here's some observations I want to make on this. They're connected. And you've got to realize that the two work hand in hand together. Closer to the emerging seminal or nodal roots, the more effective the starter fertilizer is. In essence, there's two things you got to think about in placement. you're trying to influence nodal roots. Now, those nodal roots are above the seed. They're above the seminal roots. You don't want to get too much salt close to the seminal roots. So your ideal placement should be above or around the seed so that you're not getting much intersection with the seminal, but a good chance of those early nodal roots coming in contact with that fertilizer. And the closer the seminal roots, the more likely they see salt entry. So these are some general principles that you want to think about as you think about how should I place and where should I place and how much fertilizer should I place at starter. So in-furrow, let's talk a little bit about pros and cons of in-furrow. Very effective when you can avoid salt entry, such as organic or clay soils. You want to target low rates. Your idea is to use as little, that allows you to put a tank on and plant all day. So there's some very good benefits to being able to use, and again, on a high P soil, why being able to put low rates, put it in a position so it is intercepted by those nodal roots quickly is a positive. The cons. In-furrow will cause problems. I can guarantee I will get by on a coastal plain sandy soil at 4 out of 5 years, and then the 5th year will come and bite me something terribly. I don't know what it is. It's obviously the environment. It's the amount of water in the soil, how that fertilizer gets taken up by those early seminal roots. But every once 5 years, so I have come to dread having to talk to growers about an in-furrow application on a sandy soil, because I'd love to recommend it. I have seen it work. You just saw examples of that from a Norfolk sandy home at that peanut milk station. But I can guarantee I'll go back to that same place, do that same trial again, and I'll cut me some stand down and pour emergence here this next year in a dry, warmer season. So that's something, in my opinion, I'm very reluctant to recommend an in-furrow on a sandy soil unless there's just clear evidence that they're going to use a low rate. Or there's some things they might do to get around. Fulvic or humic acids will buffer the salt effect. So adding fulvic acid or humic acids to that starter. Or you can see from that data from 2008, if we added water, we can improve the amount of seed that germinated. So there's some ways of buffering it, but again, those are added costs or time constraints to the grower. And then it limits. If you're wanting to add boron or zinc, both of those could have some salt in these micronutrient mixes. And so that, again, is something that can limit you as to what type of fertilizer you can place in that furrow. So there's some, I love a starter pop-up, but I'm just worry constantly about the conditions that I'm trying to put that in. 2x2 band. Pros, it eliminates that salt entry. Now, yes, I can still get it at high enough rates of nitrogen and potassium, or even going with higher rates of say, sulfur. So I can still do that, but it's going to take a higher rate to achieve that. And higher rates can be and should be applied. If you go to a 2x2 band, many people have asked me, well, I use 10 gallons. If I was to look at Carl Crozier's studies where he did not get a response from a starter fertilizer, every single one, he put 10 gallons in a 2x2 band. It's not enough. It's clearly not enough. It's not enough. You're going to get uneven and disappointing results at sometimes, and other times it'll work like a champ. It's just not enough in the 2x2 band. The reduced impact on root development, particularly lower rates. That's where the con is. That's it in a nutshell. If that root does not move toward that band quickly enough to take up and influence the early development or division of those cells, you don't get that starter effect. How about the 3x2 or double band? Well, increased impact from banded fertilizer. We're going to see this again, particularly at lower rate. I can get by at 10 gallons. eliminate the potential damage. Again, it splits that potential salt entry. The cons, and we're going to talk about this, these systems to achieve the desired placement without disturbing the planting process are somewhat difficult. And it can cause issues where you got high levels of residue in the soil. So these are some of the things that you've got to think about as you think about this critical question about rate and placement of a starter fertilizer to achieve your goal of better root development and consistent better yield. So that's there's the primer. I know I took about an hour, hour 15 minutes here on this primer. So now let's talk about the technology without any further questions here. It was important to understand the basics before we got here. We're going to look at three types of technology that I think are most critical or used in furrow 2x2, 3x2x2. You notice I'm not talking about broadcast here. And I'm not going to cover that here because I do not think it's very effective in achieving root growth. It'll improve phosphorus concentration at soil test, but I don't think it's very effective, as you can see earlier. So in furrow, I got a little picture of the in furrow. I got little blue circles of where we can place that fertilizer in furrow. We're going to look at those options here in an in furrow technology. Here's probably the most common in furrow technology that's been around for a long time, and this is placing in furrow below the seed. You guys have seen these, I'm sure. You put these tubes come down the front of this thing that carries the seed tube there. You can see the seed tube in this middle shot there, and it has a boot that then applies that fertilizer underneath the seed tube. To some degree, some of them disturb more soil, like you see in this front picture here. That there's quite a bit of soil being disturbed in front of that tube. You're going to have a drop there and some bounce with that seed tube like that. And then some that do a better job of, now the seed tube's off of this left picture, but this one matches better, so it's just barely at the base of the seed tube. In my opinion, that's the way. And some of them just have the tube. Yeah, they don't carry a boot at all. They use a hard tube to achieve that placement underneath the row there. Here's a good illustration of where fertilizer is being applied under the row. We're going to look at this in comparison to other choices here in just a minute. So you can see the stream and that obviously a monosim planter set up with that in front tube. I don't know that this is not difficult technology, and most of you have seen that type of system. How about this second approach? In furrow above the seed. Now, if I go back here, remember what I'm saying. There's your seed. Your seminal roots are coming out from this seed. I think I got a picture of this. I should have put that in a little bit. Yeah, there you go. There's the seminal roots coming out from that seed, that top corner of the plant with the seminal and nodal roots. So they're coming out. So you're definitely going to impact seminal roots in applying that fertilizer under the seed like that in the furrow. Remember, that's the method I used in 2008 was underneath that seed. All right, let's go forward. Here's in furrow above the seed. Now, again, this is not new technology for most of you. This is mostly done with these seed firmers. Keaton has a set. There are several companies that have different types so you can get seed firmers with a split orifice here, or in this case, you can see a single orifice. The seed, of course, is being pressed down by the firmer, and so this stream is coming out on top of the seed. So a little less likely to be intercepted by seminal roots, although still in close proximity to where they're coming out. But above the seed, more likely to see at least some interception from a nodal root, which comes out at the crown. I think I got, yeah, here's, this is John Deere's new setup with their seed tube that drops that seed in a uniform manner. And again, there you have a little tube there with a seed firmer that applies the material on top of that seed after it comes out. A little dust disturbance in the seed trench, and the seed firmer has some value in making good contact between the seed and the trench. And so you get a little less disturbance on your seed by utilizing this technology. Still, uh, some good close contact between the fertilizer and seminal roots, even above the seed. Here's a good illustration of a, whoops, this is beside the seed. Let's see, did I have another? No, that was it. Yeah, so the third method here is this in furrow beside the seed. And you can see two methods of doing this. This is the same uh, seed firmer. Again, Keaton has them, or other companies have the same thing. This is not a Keaton here, but you can see it has a Y split. So it's actually putting it on right on along the side of the seed trench there, beside where, or and slightly above. I probably got those two little streams there a little bit too low in that picture, but slightly above the seed. I think this is a better method, actually. We're going to see in a second whether it is, but a better method of getting it away from the seminal root and closer to where those nodal roots will droop down as they grow out of the nodes there. So in furrow beside the seed. I got some videos here I'll just share with you. This is an interesting system 360.
Advance it here so you can see
yeah,
it.
let me just let him.
And so we're going to talk about closing and starter all at one time. Because as this runs through the sidewall, guess what it does? It gets kind of fun as you watch it.
I'm not so sure about
a new
the
sheet
fun.
of paper. You can see the blue's going to be over deeper than the seed and 3/4 over.
Right, 3/4.
And so we're going to look for some really good effects. So if you said, Greg, I don't believe in starter, I'll never use starter, I still get pretty excited about the closing concept.
To it, you can see where the seed's been firmed in. He's been pressed in and covered top and bottom. This all the way up in here is where the wave ran. And here you can see where the blade is. So this is really a perfect example as far as we're a little bit below the seed. We're off to the side, that 3/4 of an inch from here to here. You can.
Yeah, so you can see where that is placed. That's a little different concept. I have not tested that concept, but the idea there is you're putting it beside the seed. You're trying to minimize the disturbance in the furrow by the blade running by the seed. The disadvantage I could see here is if you're in heavy residue and you haven't cleaned, aren't using row cleaners, this blade probably will pin residue rather than allow it to cut through. So, but an interesting concept as you look at in-furrow beside the seed. Now here's another concept here that has to do with beside the seed application. And you've heard of this unit here. This is this wing jet material, this jet placement. You can see there the John Deere seed tube, the row firmer, and then you've got this winged configuration running above the row firmer that's capable of actually, you could put either 1, 2, or 3 streams. You can control all 3 there. You can see it forms side the seed and above the seed. I think this is a pretty good concept. This is what we are using currently, is this winged formation, with the idea that we're not using the center tube of that wing. We're using the 2 wings to place that starter off to the side. So where you saw that starter effect that we just looked at from those trials at the peanut belt station, that was the in-furrow application method that we used. So you can see how that, you just go back and cut back to that and just step back. You can see where it attaches. And you have to have this little bracket here that goes around the seed tube, and then it attaches into this bracket, and it's quite a contraption there, carrying both the seed firmer and the wing tube there. This furrow jet application is what they call it there. All right, so gives you a little bit of an idea of what some of these methods for in-furrow application, and I'm hoping that you see some of the pros and cons to this. Above, below, beside, which is the best? Well, I have not done that study. I don't know too many that have looked at that. Now, the one that, here's a study that was done up in Michigan using, there's the seed firmer with the splitter and info furrow below the seed, and they're getting 4 bushel difference there. They ran that over 3 years. Well, 4 bushels is not statistically significant. Furthermore, you got to remember they were using primarily a nitrogen fertilizer. In fact, I don't know that they had any phosphorus in this fertilizer whatsoever. So I'm not exactly, we'll see this again here in a second in the conclusion of their study where they show some of the summary results here. So basically, not much difference in those placements from that study as far as which was the best. In my opinion, I probably, because of the disturbance below the seed, I'd be more likely to try to put it on each side. Again, I think that is a close call, and I'm not sure that we see a huge amount of difference in where those placements are there. All right, let's take a look at 2x2 band. Again, technology that most of you probably are somewhat familiar with, but let's review it. There's two different ways to do a 2x2 band. You can do it on the toolbar. This was, my dad ran a planter like this. It was a pull behind planter. You got a front bar before the main frame. And on that bar, you mounted these, now he used dry fertilizer, but obviously this is a liquid system, mounted these things so that they ran in a 2x2 configuration and placed that that starter in that band fairly precisely. And you can see I got an illustration of where that starter would be in that situation. Or we could do it in front of the toolbar. This is probably more likely to what I see many times, and most of these planters are now 3-point lift planters, so you could get better turnaround. And you can see that you could put it in front of the toolbar there. Again, the one unit is just a 2x2. The one on the right, we'll talk about a little more, actually has two discs apply nitrogen in a 2x2x2 band. So this is, again, the problem with this is a little bit of disturbance to the gauge wheels that are gauging your seed, because those discs will sometime in wet conditions pull up little slabs and stuff and cause some uneven planting. So the toolbar in front, or we can do behind the row unit. I got a picture of this, how they're looking at this here. Let me just show that. Yeah, right. Yeah, you notice there what he said. It's not going to get 2 inches deep, and that's part of the thing that I see with these following units. You've got some limitations to the depth that you can place this starter fertilizer, and that and this could be, now this happens to be a Schaffner 360 rig here. You can see it's mounted to the row unit itself on a small disc there behind the beauty here is, of course, you're not disturbing the gauge wheels, so you're not drawing up slabs of soil or making a furrow that gauge wheel has to ride over. The problem, of course, is getting depth. Now, you also notice he mentioned nitrogen instead of phosphorus there. And again, in my opinion, why he's not so concerned about depth, because nitrogen should flow down with water under those behind the row unit system. Now, here's one that we have done or used in the past. This is the Yetter system. Again, a very similar concept. They put this this opener behind, and then they have a tube that comes down here and streams, a high pressure stream that shoots that fertilizer into that slit. So in my little image here, why it doesn't, that fertilizer does, we have looked at this, actually put some dye in one time, but it doesn't all come to the bottom. It sort of comes along the sides of that slit, however deep that slit is in that fertilizer. The disadvantage I've seen in this system is a lot of times that you'll get some fertilizer on the surface and it'll pick up on your closing wheels in that configuration there. So there's some behind the row units. So those are the technologies that you're looking at in using a 2x2 placement band. So which is better, front or behind? Well, the experiences that we've had in using both is it's better in heavy residue to put it on front. You got your opener, your uh, row cleaners operating right in front of that. You got a bigger disc. You can use a tube or a double disc if you need to get better placement under heavy residue, so you get some cutting of that residue. So typically that in front is better. Behind, you've got less clearance. Your smaller discs. Those discs are less likely to cut and sometimes more likely to pin residue, which means that then that residue balls up or creates a problem, particularly if we get more than one opener in behind that unit there. But we do get that 2-bar in front. We get consistent placement. We can place it precisely where we'd like to have that fertilizer. The problem with, of course, being on front is clearance. On a 3-point mounted planter, finding a clearance in front of those units to be able to mount even a single opener is difficult. Never mind trying to do a 2x2x2 arrangement there. It's difficult to have more than one there, and issues with seed placement, particularly as more cutters we have up there, the more soil disturbance, the more likely we're going to get soil on those gauge wheels, or at least disturb our planting depth. Behind, there's better clearance for where to place it, less fertilizer on those gauge wheels or the row unit itself, more difficult to control depth, as we just spoke about. And if you're having to use knives, you can see we were talking about a yetter with just that high pressure stream. If you had a knife, and we'll show a yetter system with a knife here, why that becomes even more problematic because you're more likely to pick up residue around that knife in a planting system. So which is better, in front or behind, this technology-wise? As I told John Deere, if they could build something in front with smaller clearances that would do the job, I'd be much happier in front. I could get better consistent placement in relationship to my seed, and as long as they don't disturb my gauge wheels. It's a difficult engineering task, and John Deere knows it's really they have come with ideas to me that I have to admit are just crazy. So how about these different placements? We've looked at the in-furrow, now we've looked at 2x2. Here's some data again from this Michigan study. Now you can see where they put their 2x2. It's behind the row, the planter unit all the way there, so it's a custom rig, so to speak. Then the seed firmer with the splitter on both sides, the furrow right underneath the seed, and then they had with side dress or no starter. You know, if you look at the LSD of 7.4 bushels, the 2x2, the seed firmer, and the in-furrow all did the same. But, you know, statistically. Now, yes, numerically, you can see the in-furrow did a little bit better numerically. And given the materials that they're using, this Pro Germinator and 7 gallons of Sure-K, which is an NK material, I'm not surprised with their results. I would have loved to see this with some more phosphorus involved in there. You can certainly see it was better than the side dress, or certainly the in-furrow was, and certainly better than the no starter there. So that gives you some idea of what comparisons you might see between these systems here. Again, using low, it goes back to that principle, doesn't it? Using low amounts, which he's using low amounts at 10 gallons at the most, using low amounts or lower amounts, he's better off getting it closer to the seed. All right, let me get step forward here. All right, let's finish this up here with this new technology or this new approach to placement. This 3x2x2 or 2x2x2 band on both sides of the row. We've talked about what we've seen from field research. Now let's take a look technology that's needed to achieve this. All right. There are units to go in front of the row. This is a Martin no-till unit, specifically designed for no-till situations. You can see they got a row cleaners with the gauge wheels. It's hard to see this here. If I step back to, because that was the Martin we had here. Let me see if I can find this thing here. Go back. There it is. Yeah, this is similar to the Martin design here. You can see there's a disc on both sides, and then the tube comes down and is inserted underneath the disc, runs at the bottom of that disc. There's these flanges to try to mitigate the disturbance of the soil. So that disc just runs right through the soil, doesn't bring up soil to interfere with the row unit there. So that's an example of the in front. I have to find my place I was here. One more. Yeah, there we go. In front of the row unit technology there. Yeah, there's you see how much distance between the front of your toolbar and the front of those. You're not picking this thing up with a 3-point hitch thing. I can guarantee you on that. And a lot of front weight on your unit. So there's some disappointment. They could go with a smaller disc, in my opinion, and get the same job done. Just close up that distance just a little bit with smaller discs. I think there's be some opportunity to do an in front furrow in front of the row, 2 by 2 by 2 or 3 by 2 by 2 placement here. And then we have the behind the row unit, and this is a Yetter system. I showed you the Yetter where they just had the tubes that sprayed the material down into the trench that was cut by the disc. Here, actually, this is their latest model with the knife option for the Yetter. You can see these knives are following in this trench of this disc, and we have tested this system out here, and it worked. And in a conventional till, it works quite well. The knives do a good job of following those discs. But if you got any residue at all, why, you get into trouble here, because those two discs, if they pin residue, which they will, they're not cutting deep enough sometimes to cut the residue. They pin residue, that residue comes up behind the disc, catches on the knife, and then oftentimes it's long enough to catch on both knives, and now you've got residue dragging in these knives. Let me just show you. I've got a video of what these things look like. Now, this is the old unit.
Here we have the Yetter 2968 model. This model mounts right behind your gauge wheels where your old closing wheel tail mounted. Your closing wheel tail is mounted directly behind this system. With this system, you utilize a 2 Coulter system with 3 different depth settings. Right here, we have high pressure injectors to inject the fertilizer solution into the soil, with your closing wheels being able to close that trench right behind them. In order to make this a true 2 by 2 versus 2 by 2 by 2 study, we have a valve here and orifices that we can shut off and change in order to make that scenario equal through each side.
The second system we're testing is the Martin Dual UMO 2 by 2 by 2 system. This is a leading system. It mounts to the front of the row unit here, where your row cleaners or no-till Coulter would have previously mounted. With this system, we still have the ability to utilize our row cleaner setup. With this system, as opposed to the Yetter, it has a knife you'll see right here, and that gets the fertilizer solution into the soil. The same with the Yetter system. We utilize a valve, and we shut one side off so we can test 2 by 2 versus a 2 by 2 by 2.
Yeah, so you saw there the explanation of how the front versus the behind row unit. Of course, they were showing a Yetter system without the knife, and here, of course, I'm showing a newer system that has the knife arrangement on it. But that gives you a good idea how those systems mount up, the technology involved in those systems. These hoses that feed each of these have to each have orifices on. and the distance between the you can see that here in this picture. The orifice is clear down here right above the knife in line, and then you've got a short distance into the knife there. That distance from the orifice to the knife should be the same. So you're controlling your flow at the orifice, and if you want equal flow, you have to have same distance between the orifice and its injection point once you've dropped that flow down through those systems there. So something you have to do the same with the Martin in front. Those hoses need from the orifice to the injection point need to be the same. So you can see some of the challenges here and trying to design these 2x2x2 systems. Now, this is what I showed earlier. The reason I'm showing it again is we are using the Yetter system on our planter. Now, we started with the knife that you just saw. We started with these knife systems here this year, and then switched back to the high pressure tube because of the residue issues that we ran into during the season. So which of these did we use with the knife and which did we use with the high pressure system? Well, they all were significant. The ones that we used with the high pressure system were Beaufort and Surrey County. The rest of these we used with knife. So I could say this on the applications, we are still getting fairly similar results by taking the knife off and shooting it down that trench. And I think given the nature of some of our soils and the fact that that trench, it does a pretty doggone good job of moving that fertilizer in that trench down to that point. Now, again, we're not getting 2 inches all, but you cannot go that deep with those smaller wheels, about inch and a half. That's about as deep as you can go with some of those smaller wheels. So that's something to keep in mind there, even though we talked about 3 different depth settings. There's some, you go real deep in those small wheels, you'll start picking or catching on soil there. So anyway, that shows you some what we've experienced. Now, the folks at the Beck Seed did a little study where they looked at 2x2 versus 2x2x2 using those planter setups that you just saw. Those were Beck's folks there. And you can see here the similar data that we showed. Now they got anywhere from 5 to a 9 bushel increase in using a 2x2x2 over a 2x2, using those planting configurations that we did. These are an average. They did not find any difference, by the way, between using the Martin system and the Yetter system in their case. Finally, just which is better, in front or behind? Well, I would say this: in front is certainly better in residue. If you want to get starter down in the soil with a knife, you need an in-front unit. If that's more consistent placement. The problem, of course, is clearance. How do I get a clearance with that mounting on that planter? It's difficult to have enough clearance, particularly when you put more openers up there, and certainly more openers that they increase the chances interfering with your seed placement. The behind, we got certainly clearance. We got the fertilizer behind the unit, so these tubes and changing these orifices is much easier on these units. We get less fertilizer on the seed depth wheels. We do get some on the closing wheels. They're more difficult, though, to control the depth of placement. And certainly, I have not found a unit where I can use a knife in residue with these types of behind the unit systems. So those are the problems that I see technology-wise right now. Now, there is a third choice, and that third choice is beside the row. So let's see here. I think I've got a video of beside the row. This is what they call this conceal. And the idea here is to put the fertilizer at beside the row in a 2x2 band. Yeah, that's Skippy because I wanted to keep it short. You can see the split tube there. Let me just back this on up there. There's the knife that they use between the conceal. This is actually running, back this up, running in between these gauges. There's a good picture of where that knife is running. It's running between, this gauge wheel is a split wheel. The knife comes down between the into this slot here in this wheel and runs between that slot there. And I think in this picture we also have a where you can see, yeah, there you can see the knife. So you can see the knife is attached to the front plate of the row unit. It then has a spring and it can actually be set at different depths from this adjustment here. And then you've got the knife and the tube running into that knife with the furrow. Now, we have not tested this system. We have equipment, but we found out that it would not fit to our planter like we wanted it to. So we had to abandon testing this in a side-by-side application. What we have seen and some of the concerns that we've had and others have had is this knife. You can run this about an inch below this gauge wheel or inch and a half. You're limited to getting that knife too deep because again, there's nothing cutting residue in front of it. So it can pull up or push up some residue if it does not get around that knife. Now they've got some new things they've rigged up here to do a little better job of cutting that residue with that knife and making sure this gauge wheel stays clean and doesn't build up soil. But this is the conceal system running beside the row. I like the concept, quite frankly. I think first of all you get good consistent placement. I think I got some comments on that here. I think you get good consistent placement. Yeah, there's room for both openers. It's integrated into the row system, so you don't have a lot of extra weight and material on that. You can actually put row cleaners. Like I said, it didn't fit to our planter. Ours was a Kinsey unit as well as we would like, but it does look like it fits the most John Deere systems fairly well. And then the problem, of course, is limited. I cannot meet from everything that I've been told and the data that I've seen as people have tried these about an inch and a half. You cannot get too. If you get too deep, those knives become an issue with residue, heavy residue conditions, and of course you have no way of it. This is a 3x2x2. You're going to be 3 inches off that seed. You cannot adjust that distance from that seed. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the technology in the 3x2x2. Now, of course, there's other issues that got to go when you talk about these starter and in-furrow 2x2, 3x2 systems. And that is, how do I rig the pumps up? I think anytime you're looking at starter, you're looking at using some kind of visual or electronic indicator that flow is consistent to each of those rows. The newer things, of course, most of us are familiar with roller pumps or centrifugal pumps as a source of flow, or using these ground driven or hydraulically driven squeeze or piston pump type. The new systems that I'm seeing coming on the market, and we are testing this very well, not at that system, but a similar system using electric motors. The beauty of the electric motor system is I don't have to rely on my orifice. Actually, I can build a big enough orifice that I can adjust my rate by adjusting the speed of the electric motor and get a wider range of flow rates in my system. The other nice thing about electric motors is it eliminates some of the hydraulic or liquid lines, and the electric motor will actually can mount above the tank rather than have to be gravity fed below, because it'll create a vacuum flow. So there's some advantages. I don't have time here today to go to all these, how to set up each of these with the tube, but you can recognize you get into more complexity as you get to more openers in this system here. And you saw some of the ways they tubed it and plumb these things in the system. I think that's where I'm going to go here today. Yeah, let me jump here to this part. You know, Al asked me to talk a little bit about starter and to add in some of the technology that's out there. And I tried to do that here in a way that made it clear what your options are, what the best options you have, and what things you got to consider. I think if you look at the placement and rate of fertilizer, I like systems like in-furrow where I can place it on the side of the seed. I think that gives me some better control over what roots see that fertilizer and how to manage the salt issues in that fertilizer. On the other hand, I still, even that furrow jet, I'm very worried about using that system in a sandy soil. My next best system would be to go to a 3x2x2 or 2x2. I think I could get by with 10 gallons or a 15 gallon lower rate in that system and still ensure that those nodal roots are influenced. You can see why I could get by with a yetter and just sprinkling it or shooting it in that trench, because I only need to get it down an inch, inch and a half, and I'm beside where those nodes are that nodal root system's gonna be. So you can see where I can get away with some of that. So as long as I'm in an area where that nodal root's gonna reach to it, well, I think I could be in pretty good shape with that. Now, the problem, of course, is the technology, the complexity of the system that I have to design, and it needs to be consistent day in and day out, field in and field out. And then, of course, looking at the 2x2, I think we got to go to a higher rate in a 2x2 to really get the benefits, consistent benefits of a starter fertilizer for managing nodal root development. I'll take a few questions. I do want to make some comments, by the way, on lay-by applications of nitrogen here today. I still got 10 minutes to waste your time. So I'd sure take some questions on starter right now if I had it.